Okay, I'm here with Professor Daniel Timmer, who is an Old Testament professor at the Puritan Reformed Seminary in Michigan, and he's agreed to come on and talk to me today a little bit about the Book of Jonah. Especially, we'll focus a little bit more on the end of the Book of Jonah. So, Professor Timmer, I wanted to ask you a first sort of a fun question. What are some of your earliest memories of interacting with the Book of Jonah?
Well, they're not that long ago. What got me interested in Jonah was the fact that it's kind of an odd duck in the Minor Prophets in particular. So it's the only one that's all narrative. He's also, in terms of all the prophets, he's the only one who actually treks off and goes to a foreign nation and does what prophets do. So he was uh, an odd duck, and it was interesting. I wanted to figure out, especially in terms of if you think of mission always comes later. It's kind of a New Testament thing. What he was doing in the Old Testament, running, crossing borders, going to preach it, as it were, to foreign people. So that was what got me started in Jonah.
Nice. Now you've written a commentary. It's in the Tyndale commentary series, if I remember correctly, right? That volume, and it's on Jonah. And was there a couple of other books that were in that
Uh,
volume?
Obadiah, Jonah, Micah.
Okay, awesome, very good. Okay, well, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I think you might have already started to hint at it some in your response there, are what are some common misconceptions that people have about the Book of Jonah?
One would probably be that he's generally speaking a role model. I mean, I think our intuitive response is to assume that these biblical characters are always doing what they're supposed to do, which is, as it turns out, not always the case, and it's not only Jonah. Um, but Jonah, people might wonder a little bit why he doesn't follow the Lord's call. He runs in the other direction, but maybe we assume that the rest of the book, he's kind of like his prayer in chapter 2, for
Mhm.
example, sounds really good. Echoes the Psalms and things like that. So we might be inclined to think that apart from going the wrong direction initially, that he repents, let's say after the prayer in chapter 2, and goes to Nineveh was well intended, but the book only lets us get so far with that misconception, which is to say, it challenges us to, as the Bible itself challenges us to say, look, in this case, this prophet is not doing what he's supposed to do. He's not believing what he's supposed to believe, and the Lord sits him down, as it were, for a talk. And the book leaves that conversation open ended in terms of what Jonah learned or didn't learn. So that would be one, I think, pretty common misconception. That doesn't mean, as this whole conversation presumes, that the book can't teach us anything. It's just that in some respects, Jonah's kind of a negative example of what not to do or how not to what not to believe, things like that. Um, I would say that some people are a little skeptical in terms of the historical value of the book.
Mm,
My take on it is a bit more positive. Um, there are such things as parables in both testaments. They're
mhm,
not typically this long. They're not presented as freestanding narratives.
mhm.
Jonah, we recognize from the Book of Kings, so I don't think there's a strong reason to doubt, for example, in terms of its literary genre, that it's there to recount history. Um, some this would be outside of the evangelical circles. I think some people would be skeptical of the reliability of the story since there are miraculous events happening. But if that's your your angle, it's going to be problematic to read much of the Bible, as a matter of fact, and
Yeah.
to allow for God to do things in history. And there are odd things. There are some exceptional situations, kind of like part of Jonah's ministry, that some Assyrian sources record for us. So something that seems to portend a divine judgment, a famine, or
Mm,
an eclipse. And there are some records in which Assyrians react in similar ways, call for fasts, call for repentance, renewed fidelity to their gods. So the general scheme of the story, the events which it includes, which are unusual and
mhm.
sometimes quite so, nonetheless do fit in a worldview that's the ancient Near East in terms of fasts and expecting divine judgments, and in terms of the biblical context in the canon, stories in which supernatural things happen. You can't get very far in the canon without
Yeah.
stumbling across those.
Yeah, I always, when people talk to me about the historicity, especially of Jonah, really with a lot of things in the Old Testament, there seems to be though obviously within scholarship, there's an increasing number of questions about the historicity of things in the New Testament, but it seems to me that most of the big questions come with the Old Testament text. it always surprises me, if you start from a confessional position, that you have a commitment to the Christian faith. Your belief, the core belief that you really can't negotiate around is that Jesus rose from the dead. And so I always say, right there, if that's the core belief around which I build my faith, then the idea that someone could be swallowed by a fish and survive that, I'm like, that in and of itself does not indicate to me that it's not history. Like that can't be a disqualifying factor. Um, but then you have to wrestle with all these other questions that are difficult questions to wrestle with the Book of Jonah. But one of the things that I've been most interesting in, and the way you sort of laid it out, is the way that we have to approach questions of history in the Bible is very often not one of provability in like a scientific sense, but more a question of plausibility. Can we imagine a context or a situation in which the worldview, as you mentioned, or the things that story could plausibly be situated within? I think of that within a lot of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, where the historical record is just not going to give us very often, except for in really remarkable cases, specific evidence that can beyond a shadow of a doubt prove that someone existed. But you can create and reconstruct plausible scenarios. And so I appreciate that you brought that out, because I think some people, whether you go a more parable approach to Jonah or say it's more historical, I think one of the easy things that more conservative Christians will tend to do is sort of chastise people who call into question, acting as if the only reason to question that is a non-belief in miracles. And I just want to be like, "Well, no, you can believe that it's possible and still have questions and still, really grapple with this.
Yeah.
But it's an important process to work through. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Did you have another misconception or something to add?
No, but just to add to what you just said, or actually just rephrase the last bit. I agree that some people describe the difference. This is proven Long and Longman in their book. It's a difference between a standard of verification,
Hmm.
where unless something backs up of an event, I can't believe that it happened, versus something falsification. Do I have any reason to doubt it?
Hmm.
Other than my own worldview differs from that of the text, for example. But there are different ways to accept historical reports as plausible,
Hmm.
unless we have strong reasons to deny them, which we wouldn't want to invoke our own worldview as the only reason for which we would toss out an episode.
Yeah, and that's so important. I think one of the things that over the previous few years, I've really come to recognize something that just through reading and education you come to see is just how much the Enlightenment really impacts the way that we think. It's a very different worldview, and so we can imagine that disconnect between the worldviews is proof positive or proof negative, however you want to say, and that's really critical that we evaluate our own perspective. And I think it was C.S. Lewis that talks about the myth of progress in a different context, but the idea that our worldview is now, the definitive proof of what we can judge to be historical or not is dangerous ground. Though obviously there's great advancements that we have made, but worth being cautious as we move forward for sure. Okay, so another question I would ask about the Book of Jonah is, who should we be thinking of is the earliest audience of the Book of Jonah? Obviously, as Christians, we read it in the canon, and we want to do that. But it's also helpful to think through, who's this book written to, or with in mind.
Yeah. Well, the, unlike the epistles, we don't get the addressees in
Mhm.
Jonah, so we kind of have to approach it inductively. So if it's written in Hebrew, um, if and there needn't be really tight chronology from, let's assume, the prophet Jonah, who's in probably the ninth century, and the events that happened, the writing of the book rather. Um, it could be, I'd say, in terms of the language, the Hebrew that's used is kind of classical Hebrew, so it's pre-exilic, but that's a 200-year span more or less. So
Mhm.
from Jonah on down to almost exile. For me, the only question that would be directly affected by that would be whether Jonah could have been written to his northern audience, assuming he comes from the north, as well as the south, which went into exile later. Or if the book is a little later, the north may already be in exile, and he's
Mhm.
there writing primarily for a southern audience. Uh, Either way, so yeah, either way, because book is a certain message. Either he thinks people everywhere, the 12 tribes or the remaining two tribes,
Mhm,
um, some of them at least seem to have a problem thinking accurately about their status, their position vis-a-vis the other nations. That's
mhm,
what I would say is common, regardless of the 8th, 7th
mhm,
century Northern Kingdom and Southern, or just the Southern. Um, he's writing clearly to an Israelite audience that has certain takes certain things for granted, has a certain understanding of its place in the world and its place vis-a-vis other nations. So slightly more precise answer to the question would be he's writing to people with that kind of predilection, that kind of prejudice, if you will, in one or both of the Israelite territories, northern and southern kingdoms.
yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, 'cause I often think of, Second Kings 17, which is this, laundry list of the problems that Israel has committed that have led to their destruction at the hands of Assyria. And tucked in there are a couple of verses that says, "Hey, Judah, you're doing the same thing." You know? And then obviously we could go to different sections in the prophetic literature where it's talking about the sins of the northern kingdom, and then it just says, "And the southern kingdom did the worst." So there's some sense in what you're saying, since we can't narrow down as precisely as we can with the New Testament, that even if we hear this as to the 12 tribes or to the 10 tribes in the north, by its adoption into the canon, at some point we are also hearing it as Judah, because we know in some sense, canonically speaking and historically, the northern kingdom is illustrative of the path that the southern kingdom is on. And the prophets use that repeatedly as a warning. So I think that's a helpful way to think about that, to see that these two are, um, even if we could parse them out, I'm not sure that we necessarily have to in order to understand the message.
The only other thought that comes to mind on that point would be both either separately or both together would be aware of what you said Assyria. It's like
Okay.
the meter goes up. They're all going to respond, I think it's fair to say, negatively. They
Yeah.
may have more or less indirect or direct contact with Assyria, geographically and so on. But there would, I think, again, across the two kingdoms, be a certain distrust at a minimum,
Mhm.
if not just downright disgust or fear when you mentioned of this massive military behemoth to the northwest. So that would be another commonality between the two audiences.
Yeah.
But yes, it does.
Yeah.
We're not stuck with the kind of South Galatians, North Galatians problem
Yeah.
that you get in the New Testament. This is just Jonah to Israelites, wherever they may be,
Yeah.
for the reasons that the book makes clear.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody recently too about, um, it's so easy to chastise Jonah for his feelings towards the Ninevites, but that's a very sort of naive, understanding of what the Ninevites represented. And
Mhm.
and it's also, you know, I being in the West and me growing up my whole life in America, we don't get, existential threats from like a bigger empire than our nation. And so, but you talk to people from other countries who have experienced that, and the way that they perceive, discrepancies between power discrepancies, um, is really important. And so Jonah is not operating from a worldview or where his people can withstand the onslaught of Assyria,
Mm.
unless God intervenes. And so his feelings toward them are totally warranted.
Yeah, yeah. And especially if you remember the theological angle, I mean, it's not just that they're bigger than us, they pose dangers. It's that, we are Yahweh's people, and this nation is, clearly fully committed to other gods whom Yahweh says are not really gods, but yet they're bigger than us. So it is a challenging context for them religiously and theologically at the same time, not just politically. It's all kind of wrapped together.
Yeah, yeah, and it calls into question the power of your God,
Mm.
and so that's a really interesting point. So the next question would be, by the end of the book, how should we think about Jonah? Like, has he come around? Has he turned a corner, or has he not, or is he more of an open question?
Yeah, the safe answer would start by saying where he is exactly is an open question because we don't get his response to the Lord's last question. Um, if we quickly recap where he's been in the book, and so it's not a straight line, anyways. So we meet this prophet. We're like, okay, he's going to do what Yahweh says. Yahweh commissions him, but he goes the wrong way. Um, the events that take place on the boat are, again, he presents himself in very positive language. He's an Israelite. He fears the Lord. Um, then he tries to jump off the boat for some reason, which there are different interpretations to this. My take is it seems most likely he's just trying to put an end to his prophetic call
Yeah.
in the most drastic way possible. And then he says in his prayer, so I mentioned the prayer earlier, he says in his prayer that Yahweh threw him into waves. Among other things, the prayer is curious. And again, people differ in terms of whether they think it's a legit prayer. Um, at least in terms of what it doesn't include any repentance.
No.
So he says various things about the depths of his suffering and Yahweh's role in it. And the prayer itself at least raises as many questions as it does contribute to a positive reading of Jonah. Chapter 3 looks much better because he gets out, crawls up the beach, and heads off to Nineveh, only to discover then, and after the Ninevites repent in chapter 4, that this is the worst possible thing that can happen to Jonah. Like he wants to die. So for the reader, this would invite us to think of, what would have to happen in my life, a situation that doesn't affect my health directly, but something that is so outrageous and egregious that I cannot live if it's this way. So that's an invitation by the author to say something to, like that to us. In any case, this is Jonah responds this way to Yahweh's decision to not punish the Assyrians for what they are guilty of.
Mhm.
The exact form that that takes is not really the key element here. Um, so Jonah's up against basically what he wants versus what Yahweh in this situation chooses to do. Then Jonah gets equally angry when his little temporary sunshade, the mechanical kind of plant, um, falls dead, and he's smitten by the sun. So we're getting more insights, vague though they may be, into Jonah's character in terms of this kind of person really feels that strongly about that, and then Yahweh gets to the core of the issue in chapter 4, which is where he leaves him, that is to say, Yahweh's insists that he is, well, first of all, I should say Yahweh's very gentle. He doesn't like make it rain or double the temperature where Jonah is to, punish him for his idiotic comments. He just asks him questions. It's really quite pastoral,
Mhm.
especially when you realize how far Jonah is off because he says, look, I was afraid of this. So now we know finally in chapter 4 why he fled. I was afraid you were this kind of God, which is, of course, what God said he was in this phenomenally important passage in Exodus 34. I was afraid you're the kind of God that you said you were, which again, theologically is quite a mystery. But Yahweh asks some questions and said, look, does it make sense for you to be this angry? Jonah gives a resounding yes. And Yahweh explains a little more, shouldn't I have compassion and mercy on these people, their animals, and so on? So the book leaves the reader wondering what Jonah is going to respond, how he's going to respond to what he's going to say. And then if we're reading this not simply as an entertaining narrative, but as one that puts us in alongside Jonah, asking ourselves, what would I do? Like you were saying, if I were in a place now where I thought there was some egregious injustice, whether it's a nation threatening mine or say a government persecuting my church, how would I respond if God didn't bring justice in the short term in that situation? Um, so that's the one of the major questions I think that the book leaves us with, and Jonah is also left with the same question: is he going to revise his answer?
Mm.
Yes, I've got the right to be as angry enough to die right now, or is he going to learn from this very gentle divine pedagogy that Yahweh is offering him there?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I so often think that, um, we began this conversation talking about moral example of Jonah and biblical characters, and how that isn't always the best way to read the Old Testament or the Bible outside of Jesus. Um, I often think that many of the characters are more like a question to the reader. You know, well, what kind of person are you going to be? I actually think this way about the end of Second Kings, where the king is in captivity in Babylon and has his food all the rest of his days, and it's like, is there hope here or not? You know,
Mhm.
and what's going to happen? So I think so much of the Old Testament, in many ways, is a question to the reader. What How will you respond if you were to put yourself in those shoes? And so the idea that Jonah in the end still has a decision to make, I think
Yeah.
is a really interesting thing. Which may segue into the last question I wanted to pose to you would be, as Christians reading this from a canonical perspective, how should we hear the book of Jonah? What are some lessons that we should take away?
So let me just go on record saying it's a good question because we're assuming by asking it and answering it that this is not some episode that's watched in the past. It's of at best humorous value, though it is humorous.
Yeah.
But it fits in a much larger canonical framework. It fits in a history of redemption, if you want to use those terms, or what God is doing in this world. And Jonah, despite his non-compliance, is nonetheless a figure in it that sheds light indirectly, I suppose, on what God is doing. Um, the a phrase that I uh, developed thinking of how we should respond to this book. So not just Jonah, because God is the main actor here, and we're really, of course, taking God as the norm. So if God says Jonah's out of line, Jonah's out of line. If God says this is who I am, we should say, okay, that's God is being perfect and gracious and wonderful and all these other things. That's how I want to be. So where do I place myself on that spectrum? Um, in Jonah's case, the phrase I thought of was something like idolatry by theology, or as I'm doing
Mm,
theology, I'm going to make an idol
mm,
in my theological work. If I'm
mm,
a prophet here, you can do it anyway as a believer. It doesn't need to be in some formal role. Um, so part of the um, part of what God is correcting is the presumption, surely on Jonah's part, and whatever portion of the audience that the author had in view, that even the word grace might not always be right. I'm not sure that Jonah was really fully convinced of grace as something that's really unmerited, like you just get it because
mhm.
God gives it. There's no qualification. Jonah seems to think that it's out of line for God to be gracious to certain kinds of people, but not to everybody. Meaning he'll take the grace that pulls them out of the water and sends them to Nineveh and doesn't zap them on the spot. Um, or like you were saying about the Book of Kings, this grace that just continues all the way even into the exile. Exile is not this
Mhm,
slammed door. I mean, there's lots of damage and
mhm,
things to regret, but the Davidic covenant is there as a kind of substratum. There's grace in exile. Um, so grace has come to his audience and to Jonah in various ways, but Jonah the prophet, at least, wants to deny it to others. So
mhm,
what we're dealing with here is really what's the nature of grace? When Yahweh says he's free to be gracious to anybody, do we really allow him to do that? I think it's
mm,
hardest to say. But
yeah.
Jonah seems to have his own standards for suitable recipients of grace and not suitable recipients of grace. He's in the first category. All the Ninevites are in the second category. And when
Yeah.
Yahweh removes that line, he'd rather die.
Mm,
So it does bring into our view, first of all, the question of grace, and to come back to the redemptive historical line, what is the role of Israel in the world? What is it supposed to be doing in
mhm,
the Old Testament? So you can go with phrases like a nation of priests, which doesn't mean they're all priests working at the tabernacle or the temple. It means the nation as a whole, because it's got its own priestly tribe. The nation is to have some kind of demonstrative, declarative role to the nations. God makes this promise to Abraham back in Genesis
mhm,
12. But again, Jonah is the only prophet who actually makes it geographically out of Israel, but his ministry, Yahweh intends his ministry to do good to the Ninevites, and
mhm,
Jonah just doesn't. So that larger plan comes into view as well. Um, and it's been this whole paradigm around 180 degrees. Jonah had some bad theology, it would appear. I think I can confidently say that, and it messes up his view of God and of it
Mm,
makes him kind of messed up, and it messes up the way that he sees God at work in the world.
mm,
The flip side of that, to come to where should this book take us, among other things, is other than in addition to what it teaches us about God very clearly, is that good theology does produce is to produce right behavior, right beliefs, right attitudes towards about grace, for example,
mhm,
and to come back to the problems to Abraham, the realization that the church today is to do good. God is doing good through the gospel to people indiscriminately because
mm,
grace is indiscriminate, and it's not ours to dictate that this person doesn't deserve it, whereas I do.
mhm,
Um, so I would say, secondly, there's a bit of a missional. It's a clear assertion, even in the Old Testament, where this idea is kind of in an embryonic form, that God is really committed to doing good to others outside of Israel, even the really bad others. But again,
mhm.
this is all relative. What's really bad mean?
Yeah.
And it's the answer is it ends up being irrelevant in the book of Jonah. And then thirdly, in terms of especially a Christian reading of the book, the supreme manifestation of God's grace is in Jesus Christ, who, as someone coming to a very undesirable place. So you get John 1, he comes to his own people, he's not received.
Mm,
Philippians 2, he humbles himself in ways that we as creatures don't fully understand, and which are superlative, um, all out of grace. So it's really a wonderful reminder of the way that the direction that the whole canon is pushing, um, in that Jonah's mission to a very undesirable population, so to speak, is in some ways an anticipation of Christ's own prophetic and other ministry, coming to a world that was not really not looking for them for the most part, and certainly didn't deserve any divine grace, and yet divine grace comes in spades.
yeah. One of the things as I've worked through this book that I've been thinking about is it a missionary book? Because there's
Mm,
so many sermons will focus. I've grown up in a Pentecostal tradition that has a big emphasis on missions, and so this is a favorite text to go to, as it is in
mm,
many other traditions as well. But one of the things, as you've mentioned, that I've become more and more convinced of is that it's only a missionary book insofar as God is the missionary, right?
mm,
Like God is the one who
mm,
ensures that the message goes out because Jonah's not particularly interested, except for under threat of well or fish, as it would be. And so I think that's a really important point. And then, of course, Jesus. Um, as the where a better Jonah, Jesus is the
mm,
better Jonah, but he's also God
mm,
incarnate. And so this
mm,
this missionary move of God actually comes to earth. And yeah, that indiscriminate grace is such a powerful message in the book because yeah, when I think, you can read stories of was it a Mennonite school was shot up years ago, and then I think it made the news that the at the at the trial, these people just showed
mm,
remarkable grace and forgiveness
mm,
to the person who was guilty. Um, but that's the exact type of situation
mm,
that many people, and I've never been in that situation, pray I never would be, would rather die than extend grace
yeah,
to that's the scale on which I think about Jonah is dealing with something that
mhm.
dramatic. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. Thanks for participating. So you wrote this commentary on Jonah and a couple of other books. Do you have any current or recent projects you've been working on?
My a book I published last year now is explores the way that the non-Israelites figure in all 15 prophetic books. So to the exclusion of Daniel, because he doesn't make that August list usually in Protestant canon. Um, but yeah, so my interest in the non-Israelites continued because they play a lot of different roles, and they're not always obviously not always receiving Israelite prophets to tell them things that will help them escape judgment. Um, so that was an interesting, and again, it all started with Jonah, kind of worked my way out to the minor prophets, then
Nice.
tackled the big three at the same time. So that's my latest attempt to probe a little bit more the various roles of non-Israelites in the OT, and particularly in prophetic books specifically.
Well, awesome. That sounds like a really fun project.